I think it's a considerable honor for us here in the state of Utah to have Jim Warlick visit us. And I'm not going to go over his entire bio. You see it on the posted outside out there. But in his current position, he has responsibility for all aspects of U.S. foreign policy with the United Nations and a number of multilateral organizations. He has a very distinguished career with the State Department, including principal advisor to Ambassador Paul Bremer in Baghdad. Prior to the State Department, he worked with the Asia Foundation and the Congressional Research Services at the Library of Congress. He has a Master's of Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School. I met Jim when he was Consul General at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. That was the first time we met. I actually know his wife, Mary, better than I know Jim. And that's because of my work as Honorary Consul General for Russia in the state of Utah. His wife was a commercial officer, wasn't she, at the embassy in Moscow, and then she became the Russian desk person, and now she is the senior advisor to President Bush on Russian affairs and a member of the National Security Council in Moscow right now. So I've known Mary and worked with Mary, but it's just an absolute honor to have Jim in the state of Utah on a very quick visit to talk to us. Jim?
Well, thank you so much for coming out. I know it's a difficult time for you just before exams. It's really a pleasure for me to get away from Washington, D.C. and to come out here and to talk with all of you. I'm being billed as talking about a lot of different things today, and I'm not sure I have time for all of that. UN reform, our careers in the foreign service, Iraq. So maybe in the Q&A we can come around and talk a little bit more about that. But let me start with talking about my work now. I have this very long title, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. Phew. That means that I'm responsible for all issues involving the United Nations. So let me start by talking a little bit about the United Nations. And I understand some of you may be involved in Model UN and other things. So I'm a multilateralist. Let me tell you that there's an ugly rumor going around. It's going around the United States, around Europe, around the world. And it's something I'd like to work against. That rumor that the United States doesn't care about the United Nations, that the United States is prepared to go it alone. Hey, damn it, we're the last remaining superpower. We know how to get things done. We'll do it ourselves. We don't need the United Nations. We don't need other countries because we know what's right. No. I see things from a very different point of view sitting in Washington, D.C. In fact, our agenda at the United Nations has never been busier than it is right now. Look at the Security Council and what's happening every day. Never before in the history of the Security Council have more issues come to the United Nations. It's Kosovo, it's Sudan, it's Iran, Iraq, North Korea. There's practically no issue that you'll pick up the paper and read about that's not being addressed in one way or another, multilaterally and through the United Nations. Well, why is that? Why? Well, we've come to the conclusion, increasingly in this administration, that we're not going to be successful going it alone. We might wag our fingers at the Iranians for enriching uranium. Well, we've had sanctions in place since not long after 1979, and they haven't made a whole lot of difference. But what is going to make a difference on Iran? It's, in fact, if the international community can speak with one voice and put the kind of pressure on Iran that might, just might, make them come into compliance with their Security Council obligations and their obligations to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Sudan. You know what? We're not going to be sending our Marines into Darfur anytime soon. And our friends in Europe, I don't think you're going to see European troops protecting civilian populations in Darfur very soon. So how are we going to address what is in fact a genocide? How are we going to protect civilian populations? How are we going to provide humanitarian assistance? Well, we're not going to do it alone. We're going to have to find another way to do that. And it's going to be multilaterally. It's going to be through the United Nations. And if we want a change in the behavior of the government of national unity, President Bashir in Khartoum, how is that going to happen? It's not going to happen with U.S. jawboning, believe me. If anything, he'll dig his heels in further and appeal to many other countries for support. In fact, the way that we're going to have an effect is if the international community can speak with one voice. It's interesting. People think of multilateral issues as being those transnational issues. Well, of course, we have to work with other countries on counterterrorism. Or, of course, refugee issues or the spread of malaria. Those are pretty obvious areas where, hey, we're not going to solve those kinds of issues alone. If we're going to effectively address the issue of climate change, it's not going to be just the U.S. cutting carbon emissions. In fact, we're going to have to find a way to do this multilaterally and find a way to work with other countries. Those are the obvious issues. But there's so many other issues now that we have come to the conclusion that if we are going to be successful in the international community in achieving U.S. goals and objectives, the way that we're going to do that is not the U.S. acting alone. It's the U.S. working with other countries. And a principal vehicle for doing that is going to be the United Nations. Just look at North Korea, or Iran, or Iraq for that matter. I think we've come to the conclusion that it is not U.S. military force that's going to bring about peace and stability and prosperity in Iraq. It's going to be a commitment by the international community working with the Iraqi people that's going to make a difference. You know, it's hard. Working multilaterally is pretty hard. Your chances are you're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and see a banner headline across the New York Times that says that we had a major breakthrough at the United Nations. It doesn't happen that way. There are 192 countries trying to work together. Even within the Security Council, there are 14 other countries, 15 with the U.S. that we have to work with. Change is going to come incrementally. And we're going to have to be patient. We're going to have to work through the United Nations on issues that are very difficult, understanding that the solution is not going to come overnight. It's going to come very slowly, and that we need to have the patience and the perseverance to deal with it. Look at, for example, the issue of Burma. It's going to be pretty hard to change a regime that is so well entrenched as Tan Shui and the activities that have gone on in Burma for the last decade and a half. I don't believe that the military junta in Burma cares a whit about what the United States thinks about them. I do believe that the Burmese junta does care about the voice of the international community and the United Nations and actions taken in the Security Council. Will that change? Will that change the behavior of the military regime in Burma? Chances are not overnight, but it's a process, and we need to continue that, keeping that pressure in place. And we do see some responsiveness. For those of you who follow Burma, it's remarkable. Aung San Suu Kyi has seen more than just her doctor. There is now a liaison with the government. We do have a UN special envoy who now has access to Aung San Suu Kyi and is meeting with the military regime. Has that brought about profound change? No. But it's that kind of commitment, it's that kind of process working through the international community that will make a difference. I think increasingly, this administration has come to the conclusion that if we are going to be successful, we do need to approach our foreign policy this way. For those of you who know the Security Council, and I spend most of my time working on the Security Council, it can be very difficult to accomplish things. There are 15 countries, 5 permanent members, 10 non-permanent members that serve for 2-year rotations based on geographic representations. In the Security Council, in order to pass a resolution, in order to move forward on an issue, we need 9 votes, 9 positive votes. That's the only thing that's required, and no vetoes from the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Well, you know what? Rarely do we call for votes in the Security Council. Rarely do we see a split vote where, oh, we're just going to eke by and get that 9 votes or those 10 votes. In fact, what we're trying to do increasingly in the Security Council is to develop a consensus so that we have 15 votes. Well, why? Why don't we just settle with 9 and move on? No, because in fact, it's the voice of the international community, the strength of that voice, that's going to have a profound impact. For example, right now, Iran. You've probably read about the new Security Council resolution that's under consideration, the 3rd Security Council resolution that would increase the level of pressure on Iran. We haven't introduced that resolution yet in the Security Council. Why is that? Well, we could probably get the 9 votes, 10 votes. We've decided that until we can move forward with the Chinese and the Russians, we're not going to introduce a draft resolution. Why? Why not? Well, this is it. We want to move together so that the international community can speak with one voice. So when President Ahmadinejad in Tehran sees the Security Council, he sees 15 votes and no dissent. And so the international community continues to put pressure on. Just a couple more words on the UN. We talk often about the United Nations, and we think of it as one organization. It's really not one organization at all. It's many, many different organizations. If you ask the American people, and these surveys do take place on a regular basis, should we be members of the United Nations? Well, you might get 50% that will say yes, maybe 60%. Do you think we should make financial contributions to the United Nations? The figure falls below 50%. Do you think we should contribute $4.5 billion a year to the United Nations? That figure falls below 20%. But it depends on what question you ask. If you say, should we be providing humanitarian assistance to children in Africa? Should we be fighting malaria? Should we be working on global AIDS? Then you'll find the American public responds overwhelmingly in favor of the United Nations. In the case of providing food aid to Africa, that figure will rise to 80%. The United Nations is not just the United Nations. It's made up of a lot of different parts. In fact, I'm responsible for 82 different programs, agencies, and organizations within the UN framework. That's huge. All of them operate very differently. All of them have very different goals. Some are more successful than others. What we do need to do as a country is to think more seriously about the United Nations and what it means for the United States. And we need not just to think about the United Nations as a monolithic organization, but all the pieces of it and how it does fit into U.S. foreign policy. back in the 1990s, one of the jobs that I had was working on European security issues. And it was very frustrating at that time because it was after the fall of the Soviet Union, and everyone was looking at NATO and scratching their heads and saying, well, what do we need NATO for? There's not going to be any invasion of Europe. There's no Warsaw Pact left. What do we need this archaic security organization for? Well, no one is asking that question today, and in fact, NATO is still the club to join. And the reason for that is that we, in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but also together with our friends in Europe, we thought through what NATO really is as an organization. And in fact, we developed a vision for what, and a vision now that in terms of NATO, our European friends and allies have bought into. With the United Nations, we haven't come that far yet. We don't really have a vision. If you ask even some really smart people, where do you think the United Nations will be in 10 years or 15 years? It's very difficult to get a clear response to that. I think, coming back to where we started, we have a commitment. We need to have a commitment to working multilaterally on issues. We need to recognize that the United Nations is going to be an important component to addressing our foreign policy goals and objectives. What we need is to develop that kind of vision, the kind of vision that we once had for NATO, now have again for NATO, that kind of vision with the United Nations on how we want to work through the multilateral system to achieve some of our highest goals and objectives. Okay, let me change gears for just a couple of minutes with you because I didn't want to just talk about the UN. I did want to talk a little bit about Foreign Service, for those of you who are interested. And maybe I'll just start with the Foreign Service, and if you want to hear a little bit about Iraq, we can talk about that, but that's such a tricky issue. I'm happy to talk about that if somebody is interested and give you a little bit of insights into my experience. But let me tell you a little bit about my history in the Foreign Service. It's not so different from a lot of my colleagues. I left graduate school, and my first real job was with I met my wife in graduate school. We got married right after graduate school. I got the job first, more by accident than planning, and it was really with the Asia Foundation. It was my first real job. It's a non-governmental organization, and I got shipped off to the Philippines, which turned out to be pretty good. It was great for me. My wife worked on processing refugees from Vietnam to help them to get resettled into the United States. Well, while we were in the Philippines, she had the opportunity to join the Foreign Service. And we scratched our heads and thought, well, do we really want to do this? I was having a pretty good time working for the Asia Foundation. She was really loving her work at refugee camps throughout the country. But we decided that she would join. She joined, went back to Washington, and then, interestingly enough, came back to the Philippines as a consular officer, processing visas, taking care of American citizens who were in trouble, that sort of thing. We then, after a 2-year tour in the Philippines with me in the Asia Foundation and my wife in the Foreign Service, we went back to Washington, D.C., and we realized, well, we had some difficult choices to make because it wouldn't be possible for us to serve again overseas, Asia Foundation, Department of State. So I had the opportunity to join the State Department, and so I did. And for most of my career, for all of my career, we've been able to serve together. We've never looked too far into the future because it was always difficult to make, those hard decisions. We thought, well, how are we ever going to get jobs in the same country together, doing the kinds of things that we wanted to do? But in fact, for all of our careers, we've been able to serve together we went back to the Philippines. My first tour was in Bangladesh. We served together for 4 years in Germany, in Moscow. I went off to Iraq. Was the only time when my wife and I have been separated. We have 3 children now. 2 are in college. Those 2, I didn't think it would ever happen, but they really love international relations. And as much as they might have hated those times when we would have to pick up and move every 2 or 3 years, and they had to say goodbye to their friends, I think that they realized what a huge opportunity it was for them. Is it a career for everybody? No. You work in a big bureaucracy. You're part of the U.S. government. Sometimes your own opinions about an issue need to take second place to U.S. Policy. Sometimes you have to make hard choices. Right now you may read in the paper that a lot of Foreign Service officers are being asked to serve in Iraq and to be apart from their families. For us, it's really been a remarkable run. We have no regrets. As much as we could have envisioned a career in the private sector, neither my wife nor I have any second thoughts. She's now Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia. She has the opportunity to brief the President on a regular basis on what's going on in Russia, and has spent the last decade working on those issues. For me, I've spent the last years working on multilateral issues, both in my current job. Previous to that, I've been responsible for issues involving UN political affairs, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, NATO, Pall Mill issues. So far so good. So that's my story. As you probably know, we are continuing to recruit very capable people into the Foreign Service, and I hope it's something that, if you're here at this lecture, I know you're interested in foreign policy issues, so please give it some consideration. I'm going to stop there because I'd like to hear from you and maybe talk about some of the issues that you're interested in, and we can focus more on international organization issues and maybe talk about some more specific case studies, or we can talk about whatever other issues, including careers in the Foreign Service, if that's of interest to you. So let me stop at that and hear from you all. Any comments, thoughts?
Just raise your hand, we got the mic, we'll bring it to you.
My name is Jeff Dickamore. I'm a European Studies and French major from Bountiful, Utah. Interested in international law, and I was just wondering if you recommend getting a graduate degree or another master's degree before joining the Foreign Service or trying to get into the Foreign Service.
I think, first of all, there's no one path to get into the Foreign Service, or even once you're in, no one path to success. There's really no punch list where we're looking for Arabic language speakers or people with law degrees. I think we've tended to attract a lot of lawyers into the Foreign Service, but if anything now we're trying to create a diplomatic corps that's very diverse. And I don't just mean in terms of ethnic backgrounds, I mean in terms of, we ought to have more people with science backgrounds in the Foreign Service. We ought to have more people that really, do understand transnational issues. Maybe some people that have military backgrounds or development assistance backgrounds. So, I would encourage you not to look at your education, as a checklist on what makes me best qualified for the Foreign Service. I wouldn't approach it that way. I think what we're trying to develop in the Foreign Service are just a wide-ranging group of skills that will serve our country. Foreign policy issues are so different now than they were even when I joined the Foreign Service. An ability to talk about climate change or refugees or global AIDS. I don't think we would have really considered that back, 2 decades ago. Now we actively want people in the Foreign Service that know those kinds of issues well, who have real-world experience in those issues, and they just bring a lot of depth and expertise to the Foreign Service. I don't know if that answers your question. If you're interested in law school, hey, go for it. I think we still have a lot of recovering lawyers who find their way into the Foreign Service.
Good morning, I'm Brad Carmack. I have a biology degree and I'm a Master Public Administration student. You mentioned that the UN really isn't one organization, but several. I was wondering what some of those major, sub-organizations would be, and also how much American involvement there is compared to being staffed mostly by people from other countries as well.
Well, there are a lot of different organizations, and some you've probably heard of and probably some you haven't. Some of the most successful organizations in the UN system are, say, the United Nations Children's Fund or the World Food Program. The United States provides over 50% of the budget of the World Food Program on a voluntary basis. And when you see food assistance being delivered even to North Korea, in fact, that's funded by the United States. The World Health Organization is an organization that you probably know very well, and with your biology background, they're doing extraordinary work and have really support from members, overwhelming support from member states. We contribute substantially to that. Not all parts of the UN system work as well as those organizations do. There are organizations that don't work in favor of U.S. national interests, where the Group of 77 and the non-aligned movement have extraordinary control. We pulled out of one organization in the UN a number of years ago, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, based in Paris. And we rejoined it. The reason that we pulled out was because we were providing a substantial amount of money for an organization that continuously seemed to be working against U.S. interests, and an organization that should be promoting cultural diversity and freedom of speech, in fact, was doing quite the opposite. We rejoined it because we made a decision that we were committed to those issues, and we're working on a number of, it doesn't always work well, UNESCO, but we're addressing issues of literacy and tolerance. One part of the United Nations that you might have read a lot about recently is the Human Rights Council, based in Geneva. We believe strongly that the UN system needs a way to address human rights issues around the world. We need to be able to work with other countries on human rights. Well, really what was in place a few years ago was something called the Human Rights Commission, made up of 54 countries that couldn't do much of anything. And in frustration, the Secretary General appointed a panel, an eminent persons panel, which eventually recommended that the Human Rights Commission is not effective. It needs to be replaced with the Human Rights Council. Well, we worked very hard for a few years to create this Human Rights Council, but it's turning out to be equally disappointing. It has 48 members. It manages to spend more time addressing problems, the problems in the world created by Israel than real human rights issues like Sudan or Burma or Belarus or North Korea or Zimbabwe. While we're very disappointed with the Human Rights Council, and we've already said that we're not going to be providing financial assistance to the Human Rights Council, we are committed to working on human rights issues in the UN system, and we need to find ways to do that. I think many people who look at the UN come to the conclusion, oh yes, it is, it is an important organization or not. I think for those of us who follow closely, I think you do have to look at the bits and pieces of it and recognize where there is value and where there are frustrations.
My name is Josh Every, and I'm an international relations major. In the patient stance of negotiation over time, how does that do you find problems in the U.S., like sensational issues, and once it's out of the papers, we don't really care about it anymore? Like, how do you maintain that stance on and doing that and trying to change people's mentalities in the United States on that issue?
Well, it's really hard. Think about Sudan and Darfur. It was several years ago that President Bush stood up and said, this is genocide. And, there were thousands of people that were being killed, and that we've got to do something about it. Well, here we are several years later, and, well, there's still genocide going on, and how frustrating that is. And we ask ourselves, what do we do about it? And there's not an easy solution. And it's very easy for the Washington Post or the New York Times to write an editorial critical of the United Nations or the United States and the lack of progress that's being made. It's much more difficult to come up with a program that really will make a difference. In the case of Darfur, for example, we have to make a commitment, and the American people have to recognize that genocide is not going to disappear overnight. This is an area of Sudan that's been riddled with ethnic tensions for a long time, and there's a government in Khartoum that simply wants to exacerbate the problem rather than address it. The way that we've decided that we need to move ahead is together with other countries through the United Nations. As a stopgap, the African Union sent in a peacekeeping force of several thousand troops. We recognize that that's not sufficient, and it hasn't been able to address the underlying problems in Darfur. We brought it back into the Security Council, and in fact, we're addressing the problem of Darfur now through the deployment of a United Nations assistance mission in Darfur, and that is scheduled to be deployed by December 31st. Well, the Security Council declared that it would be so. But President Bashir stands in the way. He doesn't want Swedish engineers and troops from Thailand and Nepal. He's putting limitations on where troops can be deployed and what equipment he'll allow in. So it is very frustrating. And I think that the way we have to address it is continue the pressure on President Bashir, to continue to impose sanctions on a government that's not cooperative, provide carrots for when they are, and to demonstrate a real commitment. What would be wrong is if we throw up our hands in frustration and say, well, we're not successful at this, and walk away from a problem as serious as that. I think we've made that commitment in Darfur. I don't think we're going to be walking away. But that can be the temptation, as you said, of the American public, to have a sustained interest and commitment to seeing through particular policy objectives.
Hi, I'm Ariel Badger from Parker, Colorado, and I'm an international relations major. I was just wondering if you would suggest any reforms for the United Nations to maybe make it a better organization or more efficient in attaining its goals?
One of the things I talk about with groups, and we didn't do that today, are the dynamics of working in the United Nations. It's very strange. I have a whole lecture on this if you invite me back. It's very strange that there's a dynamic in the United Nations that only exists in New York. It's the United States and the developed world against the G77 and non-aligned movement. Well, you say, well, G77 and non-aligned movement, you mean India and Pakistan, Egypt, Brazil, Indonesia. Well, India? Our relations have never been better with India. Never. than they are today. Yet, in New York, the Indians undermine our efforts to address issues at every turn. Our ability to achieve foreign policy objectives in the UN system is undermined by this schizophrenic division between the United States and the G77 and non-aligned movement. What we need is to figure out how do we work around that? How do we break it? The G77 and non-aligned movement, out of 192 countries, 118 are members of the G77 and non-aligned movement. How can we get anything done? And it can be very, very frustrating, and especially frustrating when you see some of our friends, like India or Pakistan or Egypt or Indonesia, undermining us at every turn. Figuring out how you break that dynamic is very, very difficult. Let me give you a very practical example of what we're facing in terms of UN reform, because we have a very elaborate UN reform agenda in New York, but it's very difficult to get it adopted. Why? Because of this dynamic that exists between the US and the G77 and non-aligned movement. A few years ago, I was working on UN issues at the time. The G77 developing countries were so suspicious of the United States and European countries too, saying, oh, you're scheming behind our backs. You're working with the Secretary General, and we can't see what you're doing. What we need, said the Indias of the world, is more transparency and accountability. So, all right, more transparency and accountability sounds good to us. So, fast forward to the present time, we have a very, I think, significant program on the table now to increase transparency and accountability in the UN system. And you look at it and it's whistleblower protections, it's ethical standards, it's certain accounting standards, procurement standards. We would take it for granted. Here at this university, if you didn't operate that way, you wouldn't survive. But in the UN system, it's a whole different place. Those same countries that were calling for transparency and accountability a few years ago are the same countries that are opposing the Transparency and Accountability Initiative. Go figure. What do we do about that? And you scratch your head and you say, don't you want ethical standards? Don't you want whistleblower protections? And they say, oh, yeah, but we're not sure why you're behind this. Why are you supporting it? There's this suspicion and cynicism. We have a lot of reforms that we need to make in the UN system. Transparency and accountability ought to be right there at the top. We have a long list beyond that. But in order to achieve that we need to figure out how to develop some new dynamics with other member states.
My name is Sierra Sloan. I'm from Salt Lake City, actually, and I'm majoring in, I haven't really decided, business or international relations. And I also have a United Nations reform question, especially with regards to your comments on the United States' desire for consensus, especially in the Security Council, and considering that the General Assembly has been recently reopened the issue of reform in the Security Council. I wondered what bearing the United States' desire for consensus had on their foreign policy with regards to those different types of reform and expansion and veto power and basically those types of issues.
Oh, you have to invite me back for another lecture on Security Council reform, because that is really and truly complicated. We do favor expansion of the security. Well, nomenclature is important. We talk about UN reform. A lot of people think UN reform. Oh, you mean Security Council reform? Well, not really. But, okay, Security Council reform. Oh, you mean enlargement of the Security Council? Well, not really, but okay, enlargement of the Security Council. Well, this is an issue that's been on the table for a decade. There's the argument that, well, doesn't the Security Council look a lot like 1949? Hasn't the world changed a little bit? Shouldn't Africa and Latin America be better represented on the Security Council than they are now? Shouldn't we do business differently? And by the way, why should the US, France, UK, Russia, and China have vetoes? Well, our position on Security Council reform is we're saying, okay, this is not a static institution. We do need to change it. And we do need to expand the size of the council. It does, there is an issue of legitimacy over time. All institutions need to change, but not so fast. What we don't want is a Security Council that becomes larger and more bureaucratic and inefficient. We care deeply about the Security Council, and we don't want to see the Security Council undermined simply because some member states believe they're underrepresented in it. Well, this is not a dynamic where it's the G77 and non-aligned movement. This divides in much more complicated ways. Here we have, well, maybe India should be a member of the Security Council, but wait a minute, Pakistan doesn't like that idea. Maybe Brazil, shouldn't Brazil be represented on the council? But wait a minute, Mexico thinks maybe they should be Latin America group. Africa, let's think about that a little bit. South Africa, maybe. Ghana, Nigeria. Oh, but wait a minute. Egypt is a member of the Africa group. Maybe Egypt should be on the council. You see how complicated it is? And so we have an ongoing discussion right now in New York about how we can move forward on this issue of Security Council expansion. But it's going to be a difficult process. We've said that we are committed to Security Council reform, and we'd like to see Security Council reform undertaken in the context of a larger package of UN reforms. One addition, we support Japan as a member of the Security Council. We've said that for years, and we stand by the only one country that we mentioned by name in terms of Security Council expansion.
To call it there. So, any final comments? We can get you underway.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. We didn't get to Iraq. Another reason to invite me back. Okay?